Hello and welcome back to the NOTCAST. If you've not seen one of these before, I, like everybody else in Britain, has either a YouTube channel or a podcast where I talk about something that interests me, infuriates me, or somewhere in between. Generally, everything I've talked about previously has been about things that I love or like. And sometimes I end up thinking, that's a very narrow remit. Maybe I should do more things. This is number 341, by the way. There are 340 previous episodes of this bollocks you can go through if that's what you want to watch. And I have had a little gap in transmission because I've changed my medication and had a little bit of a side effect upon that. So I felt a little poorly over the past few days. Today, I am talking about one of Britain's best loved bands, but not, in my opinion, one of Britain's best bands, who formed in 1988 or thereabouts. And their early years and their first album, the band is Blur. I'm sure you've heard of them. A band that I didn't think, when I first heard them, I had pegged on for headlining Wembley Stadium in 2023. And as you'll probably notice, this episode is CD heavy. No vinyl for Blur. I've got a couple of bits, but I did have vinyl for Blur, but I decided at a certain point that I'd have preferred to have had the money that they were then selling for rather than the records themselves, because at the end of the day, it's just stuff. And at some point, it flips from the stuff that you own to the stuff owning you. Also, I should bring out a couple of things which I've mentioned or I've used as background reference material, aside from my fastly fading memories. I haven't got Graham Coxon's autobiography yet because it's only just come out. Autobiographies always come out at Christmas. They always get stuck into people's Christmas stockings and then they get donated to charity shops or sold cheaply at the works for about £1.50. The first book, Alex James's Bit of a Blur, or as I like to prefer of it, Bit of a Twit, which was published in 2007. Definitely didn't pay full price for that. And another one, which is a pretty important book actually to grounding of the whole kind of what happened at the time, The Last Party by John Harris, subtitled Britpop, Blair and the Demise of English Rock. Which has interviews with people that don't normally give interviews, which is quite interesting. I've also got Stuart McConey's 3862 Days by Blur. I did have the original paperback, but when I realised it sold for about £80, that's how much I sold it for. I did used to have a whole bunch of Blur t-shirts as well. Sold those because they sold for more than I paid for them, and I wanted the money more than I wanted Blur t-shirts at the time. And I think the other thing which I should point out before anybody gets too snobby about, oh, well, you haven't got the original CDs. Yeah, I did, and if I wanted to, I could buy them for £1 from a charity shop. About 10 years ago, I bought this fancy box set, Blur 21 discs, chock full of Blur stuff, for about £70, and turned my other CDs off things that were on the shelves into things that weren't on the shelves. We probably need to talk through, because what I'm thinking about doing is doing a series where I kind of group around particular years in musical history. Now, I know it's not very original or very exciting for an old man to talk about old music, because the internet has a dearth of guys that do that. Almost as few people talking about music as it has people talking about movies on iTunes. And for that, what I'm thinking about is I should do like a focus around a certain period of time. So the episodes kind of lead into and feed into each other. So yes, there will be episodes about Pulp. There will be ones about Oasis. There will not be ones about Cast, because I do not like Cast. And there definitely won't be ones about Shed 7. So let's cast our mind back a little bit. Of course, you may or may not have been around at the time, and your memories will be different to mine, because I like different bands to you, almost definitely. And if I had to pick one band that I thought was going to be huge in 2023, Blur were not going to be the ones. I always thought, the musical climate, let's say early 1990, what was big and popular? Well, we had the Stone Roses, we had the Happy Mondays, and we had James from the Manchester scene, Manchester, as they like to call it. And you can see the influence of these bands on the early Blur material, and the use of, I think, baggy, although I hate that word, very kind of mechanised, primitive dance drum beats, drum machines and things like that, which you can hear on things like There's No Other Way, Bang, to an extent, I Know as well. I will be talking about Stone Roses at some point. I'm sure I will. I've got everything of theirs, apart from that 112-inch. And then also later in 1990, Jane's Addictions, Ritual de la Habitual, an amazing album, much, much better than pretty much every other record I will be talking about, and definitely about 10,000 times better than the Blur debut. 1991 had also a lot of interesting little kind of musical scenes that were going on. REM had just done Out of Time, which again was selling by the literal truckload. Oops, dropped a drink over. That's naughty. I've got that just out of shot. We had My Bloody Valentine's Loveless finally came out. Ned's Atomic Dustbin's Godfather. Electronic. Oh, that's upside down. Pretend that's the right way up. Electronic there. The Wonder Stuff. And Never Loved Elvis, although, of course, that's not really Never Loved Elvis. This is a double CD. That's Never Loved Elvis in there. That's a double CD promotional version of it. On the dance side, although I prefer to think of it less dance, because you don't really dance it, but more on the electronic side, we had Massive Attack's Blue Lines, which has aged very well. The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultra World, which I think has been overlooked in history. Orbital's Green, at least I think Orbital's Green, 1991. Nights of Reb's Ebhead, which I love Nights of Reb. I happily talk about them with anybody. Not sure anybody wants to talk to me about them. And then, of course, Primal Scream's Screamadelica and Lush's debut, Spooky. This was the climate that Blur were born into and Leisure came out of. At the time that Leisure was released, it felt like it was already dated. It was already old. And the band had, as Damon described it, were well, Alex said it was very tightly controlled by the record company, which is exactly true. So you go back a little further, you go back to the very first days of the band when they were called Seymour, 1 7-inch single to their name released in the Blur 21 box set. This is a live recording of a track called Superman, which was recorded at the Square in Harlow in Essex. The 8-song show does exist, and they have a performance of There's No Other Way in that. See, they were called Seymour to start with. But the strange thing is Blur, Seymour, whatever they were called, were never predestined for success. I think it's fair to say that Damon was very driven. As he said himself, is that I was very driven and prepared to do anything to succeed, is what he said in Q magazine. And unfortunately, when you're prepared to do absolutely anything to succeed, the flip side of that is whatever you do, if you alter it in order to be successful, it then starts to sound a tiny bit inauthentic or as an element of yourself and not a whole representation of who you are as an individual. And so that's where we have some of the early material. So early stuff by Seymour, which has been released. There was, I need to remember which shelf I've stuck it on. There was the Sunday CD single here, which has some recordings by Seymour, the pre-Blur Blur. This has Dizzy, Fried and Shimmer on it. I don't think those are on the box set. And this the version of Sunday, which is in the Blur 10-year box set that was released in 1999, the first 21 singles. This also features a number of the Seymour recordings, including Long-Legged, Mixed Up, and Tell Me, Tell Me. Now, those are songs which are not very good. You listen to those and you don't hear the kernels of an amazing band being born. Like a great many bands, Seymour were not born great. They didn't have greatness thrust upon them. They strived to be good. And at a certain point, they achieved that. But as with the theory about the 10,000 hours, when you start off from a position of nothing. And you start off from a position of not being necessarily particularly good at things. Listen to a lot of bands' really early material, the pre-album material, and the demos that they wrote that didn't go onto the album. I'm thinking very specifically some of the early U2 stuff, some of the bootleg Wonder stuff that came out. Those were not album tracks. Those were a band finding its feet and learning how to write songs. Seymour is exactly the same stuff for Blur. And Seymour were not the first band which Damon had been in. His second band was called The Aftermath with James Hibbert, who left because he liked Marillion and prog rock. And then a band called Real Lives with Alistair Havers, who again didn't go anywhere. But then the third band, or the fourth band, Seymour, where Graham Coxon came on board. where Alex James joined the band and Dave Rowntree joined the band, was where things started to coalesce. And suddenly you had a sense that something was perhaps a little bit better than it had been previously, although Alex was the last member to join the group. Realistically, the early years of Seymour were in no way was this band destined to be enormous or successful. This band was one of dozens, if not hundreds, of bands that were ploughing the same furrow, trying the same stuff, and throwing things at the wall and seeing what fit. They were never predestined to be successful. Leisure as an album sounds incomplete, it sounds insincere, it sounds unfocused and generic indie pop. And realistically, some of that material could have been anyone. And there were loads of struggling fourth division indie bands that sounded just like Blur and Seymour at the same time, that fell to the wayside because for some reason the stars didn't align, they didn't get lucky, they didn't have a hit, or they got to number 42 instead of number 38, or there was a musicians union strike the week that they were meant to go on Top of the Pops. There was no Top of the Pops that week and the band didn't make it. You know, it happened to dozens of other acts at the same time. It happened to be that a confluence of events lined up and Blur got that shot, which they were successful at. It certainly wasn't with the first single, which got to number 42 in the charts. And you think about some of the other bands that had happened, there was very little individuality. You could have listened to Candy Flip or The Farm or, some of the other acts, pre-Nirvana, and indie felt really short of ideas. There were some great bands in there. There were some awful bands in there. Sometimes I saw a great band and an awful band on the same day. And there was kind of like, as I said, bands like The Farm and the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays. And that stuff had started to turn by the time it got to summer 1991. There was a notoriously homophobic interview with the Happy Mondays in NME around the release of the Judge Fudge single. And the Happy Mondays never came back from that. Now, these days, given how much people are keen on being judgmental around people that are different, a homophobic interview would probably be no career impediment whatsoever. But at the time, there was a view that, really, that's the thing that you're going to pin your colours to the mast on? Whereas these days, if somebody's transphobic, it doesn't end their career, which, ask a trans person how they feel about that. But I'm not going to talk about that, because if I wanted to talk about that, I would, but I don't. I talk about what I want to talk about. And right now, I want to talk about Blur and Seymour. So the band signed to Food Records, and they signed, I think, was it a 7 or 8 album deal for about £7,000? Their lawyer said it was the worst record deal in history, but they signed it because that's what they wanted to do. And I think before the band had formed, Damon, who started playing sax at 5 and then started playing guitar at 12, needed a foil to work with. And in Graham Coxon, he found somebody that was able to push back against him and define against him. Now, the cliche is that necessity is the mother of invention, which is kind of true. But at the same point, if you have somebody that bounces your ideas off you and tells you whether they're good or bad, if you have no men around you as well as yes men, your decisions are going to get better. If you're just surrounded by yes men, there are very few people who will tell you that your ideas are bad ideas. And that's a very important thing. And you can see that happening in certain people's careers. And I'm sure I'll get to talk about those when the solo years happen for various artists, which I like, where you can sense that the sense of resistance from other people has started to disappear. And therefore, you get a sense that things are not the same as they once were. When Graham showed him the records, Graham said, listen to this, listen to that. Because some people have an older brother or an older sister that will do that. That wasn't really the case. It was more a case of Graham showed Damon music that then shaped and influenced and formed his influences after that. And so things like the Specials, Two Tone, Graham brought his Syd Barrett influences onto there, his noise rock influences. So tracks like Chinese Bombs, for example, on the Blur album, they're not new radical things that someone goes, oh my God, I had no idea. Blur were always doing that. They were doing it on the B-sides with songs like Day Upon Day and Inertia and Luminous and things like that. They were always there. They just weren't putting them on the albums because the albums were being focus grouped to death by people that wanted another Jesus Jones. One Jesus Jones is fine, by the way. I love Jesus Jones. But one of them is enough. In the same way that you only need one AC/DC, you don't need an Airborne as well. When Alex met one of the other members of the band, and I've forgotten who said this, he said, "I thought he was an idiot, a pompous, big-headed fucking moron with a shit band." Well, that's what happened when Alex met the rest of Blur, and suddenly the band formed together. They were called Circus, then they were called Seymour, and then they were called Blur. They signed that deal, and they were given a list of names to choose from. I think it was 4 sides of A4, according to the book that I've read. And on those names, you will recognise the names of other acts that played in Food Records. They're on this tape. This is the Food Records 1991 Christmas party cassette that was given away to the first 2,000 people that went to the band's Christmas show, or the label's Christmas show, in December 1991. Also bands on that list, which Dave Mouth and Andy Ross were kind of suggesting that they would go for, are Whirlpool and Sensitize. And tracks 1 and 2 on here, by the way, are by Whirlpool. That's a demo of a track called Live It Up, and Sensitize doing a track called Heaven Help Me, which I have no recollection of ever hearing those two. But it's nice to know, in the same way that Radiohead changed their name from On a Friday, is that someone went, "Your name's shit, time to change it." EMI Records, who bankrolled Food, I believe, created, and there was a lot of bands that did this, or a lot of labels did this, fake boutique indie labels that were bankrolled by other acts. So on EMI, for example, at the time, you would have had Pink Floyd, you would have had Electronic, you would have had Pet Shop Boys, I think you'd have had Kate Bush, you'd have had a load of bands, and very few of them had much in the way of credibility. So these labels formed these fake boutique labels with names like Food and Scorch that didn't really exist, but were just a desk in the corner of another thing, another record company. And oddly enough, you only really knew that they were related when you saw a tiny bit of print at the bottom. So a tiny bit of print here, which is, this compilation is owned by Food Records under license to EMI Records. It's not really owned by Food, it's owned by EMI. But it was a way of trying to disguise to you that these were these cool indie labels with cred, because credibility was everything. Well, see, people think about credibility. I think of it more as integrity. If you don't have integrity, you don't have anything. But it's important to make people think that if you're an indie band, you are actually an indie band. You're not just a standard rock band in disguise. The whole world of the NME and Melody Maker in the 90s was pretty fucking strange, which, of course, I will talk about when I get further into the lifespan of these bands. The first single was She's So High. Here is the CD single from the 21 singles box set. And it was controversial because the picture on the front was an adaptation of a well-known piece of 60s controversial art, a naked woman on a hippo. And that obviously upset a few people. And some people were banned from going to various student unions if they had the T-shirt with this on, including, of course, one room where the band were playing in 1991. She's So High, and I Know, didn't chart particularly well. Got to number 42 in October 1990. And it just didn't work. It didn't hit. Now, She's So High and There's No Other Way are probably the songs that the band play the most from the album live to this day, followed up by Sing. Mostly everything else on the record has been written out of history, including the absolutely awful Bang, which I'll be dreadful about in about 3 minutes. It didn't sell particularly well. And at this point, what you could already see is that the band were being forced to push some of their better material onto B-sides or off the album. So the B-sides on this were Down, Sing, and an extended version of I Know that repeats and loops a drum section to the point where it becomes monotonous and boring. This is not a great debut single. Not a great place to start at all. Absolutely not. And then in April 1991 came the first Blur song that most people heard, which is There's No Other Way. And here is There's No Other Way, which is, in my opinion, my big memory of There's No Other Way is that If the DJ wanted to kind of move between various genres, if he wanted to move from Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, James, into Pop Let Yourself, Ned's Wonder Stuff, There's No Other Way would be the transition track that the DJ would play between the two, because it stood with one foot in both camps, or vice versa. So, if you played Ned's and then you wanted to play, or you wanted to move into Happy Mondays from Stone Roses to keep the groove going, you'd go with There's No Other Way, which is, it's a fine song, but it's a perfectly adequate song. It does the job it's meant to do. It does it okay. It's not brilliant. Absolutely in no way is it a brilliant track. It's got sloppy lyric writing. It really has. In fact, I think on the album Leisure, Damon uses the way, say, day, they rhyming structure, I think 72 times, which is almost as many times as the House of Love used the word I on one of their albums, which I think was something like 200 times. And you kind of think that's a very limited vocabulary that you're dealing with there. If you wanted to look at it, what's the reading age of AC/DC? Probably about 6. What's the reading age of Leisure? 4? Maybe? I don't know. This is not trying to get snobby. The reading age of the Hermeneutics Holy Bible is probably about 150. It's got a very broad vocabulary. But when you have a limited set of words that you use in your vocabulary, you have a limited set of ideas that you're able to articulate and address in the work that you produce. And There's No Other Way is not a great single at all. It's okay live, it's quite fun, but it's empty. It's empty calories. And the way that I've always thought about There's No Other Way is that it's kind of like candy floss or sugar. The image and the sound of the band throughout the whole of this period has been squashed and diluted by corporate interference. So whatever Blur wanted to achieve, they couldn't achieve, because the songs and the mixes had been bent towards success. The drum patterns on There's No Other Way had been replaced by a drum machine. And that happened again around about the same period. The songs had been kind of focus grouped and tested, as Damon described it. Thank God there was a time that you could make a record and not be discarded. But at the same point, the band didn't have much choice about some of the decisions. Like, what's the final track listing of the album? Probably chosen by the record company. The songs that the band were playing live were a better representation of what the band were about and the things that the band wanted to achieve at that point. So the noisier, rockier edge of it, the stuff that's influenced by Dinosaur Jr., the quirky use of lyrics and melodies and conjunctions between the two and bridges, which is heavily influenced by early Pink Floyd and some psychedelia, completely wiped off Leisure. That stuff was focus grouped onto the B-sides. And of course, this period was formatted to fuck, to use a technical term. You'd have a different B-side on your 7-inch, your cassette single, you'd have 2 CD singles. You'd end up with, like, There's No Other Way, for example, has 5 different B-sides. So Inertia, Mr. Briggs, I'm All Over, Won't Do It, and a live version of Day Upon Day. Day Upon Day is a fantastic Blur song, which not enough people know, which has only been a studio recording circulating of the BBC Mark Goodyear session from 1990. The version that's released on here is a live version. It is recorded at, and let me just quickly check, Bath Moles, which has recently closed. Sorry, Bath, you've just lost a fantastic venue. And there's a Blur remix and an extended remix on here as well. So that's 8 songs, 5 B-sides. There's No Other Way is also really, really pivotal for 2 forms. The first one is, it's the first time that the band have written a song which is about a third-person observation of somebody else in the track Mr. Briggs. The songs before then were Blur singing about I, me, us, you, them. Mr. Briggs was a song which was an observational song where Damon took a step away from the personal and started writing about things that he had observed and seen. This was going to be a major recurring theme in all of his lyrics throughout the rest of his career, from Arnold Sane, or whatever it's called, all the way through to Yuko and Hero, although obviously that's also 1995, and where he's moved away from the personal towards the observational. And you kind of end up having a difficulty to try and work out, well, what actually is Damon's artistic identity? What does he believe? What does he feel? And he shies away from that in a lot of his lyrics and a lot of his work. And it's difficult to see maps the common thread between Blur, Gorillaz, The Good, The Bad and The Queen, and his solo work, and some of his other stuff, where you kind of go, I'm not getting a picture of who Damon is. The songwriting is an artistic exercise. It's not personal. It's not him writing about things that mean things to him. It's about him writing about things that he's seen on television, which to me makes the lyrics perhaps not as effective as they could be. I'm going to be more scathing about that when we get to the Think Tank album in 2003. Oh, you can hardly wait. There's No Other Way charted at number 8 in the UK charts. At the time, the band also went in the studio and recorded a track called Bad Day and one called Close, which were both potential singles. Bad Day did I think get some remixes. One of the remixes was issued on a promo 12-inch of, there was a promo 12-inch of Bad Day and High Cool. The remix of High Cool is on this Food cassette. Those remixes are not on the Blur 21 box set because they were commissioned without the band's approval. There was also a toss-up between There's No Other Way and Come Together. And it's at that point that the band started working with Stephen Street, producer extraordinaire, who also produced The Smiths. You may have heard of them, and co-wrote a lot of Morrissey's early solo material with Morrissey, who then saw in Blur the same thing that you saw in The Smiths, the sense of a gang, the sense of a unit, and the sense of belonging, which once the Smiths had dissolved, Stephen Street hadn't necessarily seen previously. So There's No Other Way is a pivotal song in the band's history for two reasons. Firstly, Stephen Street. Secondly, Mr. Briggs and the third person observational songwriting. Actually, third reason, number 8 in the UK charts, which is the first time that I really heard them. I heard She's So High a couple of times in clubs and things, and I was like, sounds like a bootleg farm to me. When I heard There's No Other Way, and I'm like, okay, there might be something here. There might not be. I don't know. And that was followed up, that song, with the third single that the band released. And that single did, pretty well, all things considered, although it's not a great track. Charting at number 26 in the UK pop charts, Pop Kids, is the July 29, 1991 single release of Bang. Written in 15 minutes. It's generic, bland, somewhat boring indie. It does the job, but it's not as good as There's No Other Way. It is the Blur song or the Blur single that the band hate the most. It's the one that Dave Rowntree said will be legally prohibited from appearing on a Blur Greatest Hits record, which, even though it got to number 26, it was the sound of a generic kind of second-hand diminishing returns attempt to recreate the same magic in a bottle that you got with There's No Other Way. In the way that, sorry EMF fans, I believe and unbelievable, two singles on the back of each other were actually very, very similar to each other, and sometimes people mistook one for the other, were too close to be able to give the band a definitive identity at that point in time. Bang, and There's No Other Way did exactly the same thing. They slotted very neatly into a generic indie dance kind of furrow and stuck there. There was very little sign or indication of what Blur were going to become in the future. For all intents and purposes, if Leisure had been the only album that Blur had ever made, they should have been, and could be, headlining the Lexington to 250 people on a Wednesday night, playing the album in full, Leisure, and being fourth on the bill at the Butlins Weekender in Minehead when they're playing on their weeks off, or days off, or weekends off from being supply teachers. That's the certain fate that Blur avoided, and they came very close to having that fate. And in some respects, if Leisure had been the only album they ever made, it would have been a fate probably about fitting for their abilities, because Leisure is not a good album at all. If you get the impression that I like it, you're absolutely wrong. I don't. It's awful. It's a terrible, no good, very bad album indeed. Although it does have a couple of good songs on the B-sides and on the various singles, including, of course, Sing. Sing being on the B-side of the very first single, She's So High, and also appearing on the UK version of Leisure, but not the American version, which means that Sing was first released in the US on the Trainspotting soundtrack in 1996, which is good news for America. The band now playing is one of their best songs. But again, having been focus grouped by record companies, it ended up squashing and generically kind of squishing all the personality, the rough edges, the beautiful human elements about art, and turning the band's music into mass-produced pop music, which is absolutely a fate worse than Megadeth. So Bang went to number 29 in the charts, and then released on the 27th of August 1991, came the band's debut album, Leisure. Now, let's talk about what came out about this time, so it gives you a feel for the world that the world was living in at that point. I have to make sure I pick up the right thing. So, 27th of August 1991, that was the day that Pearl Jam released 10. The same month, Metallica's Black Album, honestly this is a Metallica album, not a Spinal Tap album, came out that week. Nevermind came out on the 24th of September, less than a month after Leisure. Bad Motorfinger by Soundgarden came out. Blood Sugar Sex Magic, which I refuse to have in the house because the Red Hot Chili Peppers are the worst fucking band on the planet, came out on the 24th. Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion came out in September. Also hot on the heels of that, we had the Cranes' Wings of Joy and Talk's Laughing Stock, as well as U2's Achtung Baby, and fast after that, Therapy's Trouble Gum. Leisure was an album out of time. It didn't belong in the time which it was released. It was an album that was made to fit in perfectly with the world of 6 months before and not the world of 6 months after. Something like Nevermind, and I'm going to be talking about Nirvana in due course as well. Nevermind came across and made anything else that have sounded in any way inauthentic or less than fucking furious sounded like it was obsolete, overweight and out of date. And that's the world that Leisure came into. Leisure was stillborn because it was made obsolete within a month by Nevermind. If you had the choice, pardon me, between listening to Leisure and listening to Nevermind, I'm going to be honest, kids, I listened to the fuck out of Nevermind, and I bought tickets to see Nirvana in 1991 and 1994. I did not buy tickets to see Blur because I listened to it and went, bang, there's no other way. Why would I want to listen to that when I could listen to Smells Like Teen Spirit or Lithium or In Bloom or anything on Nevermind? Leisure was an album that had been made almost by committee. As Damon said in 1999, he said, Leisure has no identity at all. If we'd been allowed to put B-sides on it, it would have been interesting. We were told what to do continually. Alex said of the band's American record company, again in 1999, and the band's American record company was SBK, that had Right Here, Right Now by Jesus Jones at number one. They wanted a Jesus Jones too that were going to get to number one in America. Alex said, SBK were the biggest bunch of inept, soulless, artless fuckwits you could ever meet. Well, Alex hasn't met one of my exes. But aside from that, in fact, he might very well have done, I don't know, given how promiscuous he was at certain points. But that's what they thought of the record company, and rightly so. Leisure is a boring album where all the interesting and exciting parts of it have been scraped away and replaced with things that have been tested on humans for irritancy and acceptability. So the album, as it is, Leisure, is a risible failure because it has no distinct personality at the time it came out. The record company wanted generic indie dance, and they decided to flatten the band's rough edges that made them interesting into something that would sell copies. In fact, even the cover there, which is from the Holton Picture Library, it's a photograph from 1954, which was used in a magazine to talk about modern, hip and happening bathing outfits in the 50s. It communicates very, very little. It could have been any one of a dozen albums that were released that year. There was no sense when you look at the cover of Leisure and you go, that's distinctively, absolutely Blur. You look at it and go, well, you could have replaced the words there with Whirlpool, Sensitize, The Farm, not the Happy Mondays, because Happy Mondays had Peter Saville. You could replace it with Soup Dragons. You can replace it with any one of a dozen middling Division 4 indie schmindy bands that were just about to go on a 50-date university tour on the back of one top 40 single, which is exactly where Blur were. And it was not something that I totally aligned to. So this is me being, quite snobby about it. But if anyone tells you that Leisure is an unsung work of genius, they've never listened to it. It isn't. It's a very typical album of the early 90s, a kind of indie band album that has been softened and defocused and squashed out and focus grouped so that all the interesting stuff gets taken off and shoved onto B-sides. And so, again, I've listened to it about 3 or 4 times this week in preparation for this. And I've listened to songs like Fool and Wear Me Down and Birthday, and I can't remember them. I mean, God knows how the band remembered them, but these are not amazing songs at all. And some of those titles, Slow Down, Fool, Bad Day, Birthday, what are they trying to communicate? Okay, REM had a song called Bad Day. Nadine Shah has a song called Fool. Sugar Cubes had Birthday. These are generic titles that communicate nothing. And I'm listening to it and going, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to achieve? Or are you trying to sell music in the way that you're trying to sell fucking baked beans on a CD? Because that's about the degree of personality that exists within this album. It's basically not very much. And the band had this horrible sense, as Alex said, of being very tightly controlled by the company. They were almost employees in Blur Limited, doing what they were told by the boss, and the boss was the record company owner. And in America, the label did unauthorized mixes of Bang and did a Blur to Go EP. What an awful name that was. And the band then went on tour in America. They did a 44-date tour in early 1992, primarily just to sell T-shirts. And the reason they needed to sell T-shirts was because their manager had managed to put the band £60,000 in debt, and £40,000 had gone missing, which is not the first time that had happened. So the band suddenly found themselves needing to tour America and sell loads of T-shirts in order to stay afloat, not go to jail for not paying their VAT because the band's accountant hadn't paid the VAT. This is a catastrophic car crash of cataclysmic proportions. Sorry to break the alliteration there by using the letter P instead of the letter C's. But at the same point, it broke the band. The band were broke. They loathed each other. They did something like 44 shows in 46 days. The shows were fundamentally mostly a drunk shambles. Damon said, I used to feel I'd done a good gig if I was sick. I haven't learned that you can drink all day and go on stage, is what he said in 2012. The band did a tour not supporting, but there was a four band package deal with My Bloody Valentine. I think it was Dinosaur Jr. And Jesus and Mary Chain in arenas in March 1992. And they played like a 40-minute set there. It was called Roller Coaster after the previously released Jesus and Mary Chain EP in 1990. But it was a bit... What was it all about? What were they trying to communicate? It wasn't really sure, really. And then you couple on that, then you've got these unauthorized mixes of Bang that have been like thrown through an indie scrambler, like when you make a milkshake and you spin everything up and it comes out and it's just a mush. And that's what those mixes were. They were awful, generic, crappy indie dance nonsense, compounded with the fact that the band hadn't paid their VAT because they'd been defrauded and they had to go on tour in order to not go to jail. The interesting stuff was on the B-sides around about this album. And obviously the indie singles were obviously including Bang. And the band was starting to play previously unreleased material, particularly a track called Turn It Up and Oily Water. A demo of Early Water appears on this cassette, but I think that demo is on the 21 box set Rarities selection as well. And they'd also recorded a song called I Love Her, which was then issued onto their fan club in 1998, and a song called Close. So Leisure was a time where I was kind of watching the band from a distance and going, they could be good, but they aren't. They're not there yet. And they'd been lapped by grunge. You know, Nevermind had put everything into relief. It made all the spandex wankers redundant overnight. It made a lot of the indie music look like the non-committal nonsense that it frankly was. It was, you know, some of it was empty and some of it was meaningless, and you kind of sat there going, what's a song like Wear Me Down about? I don't know. And then there were some other songs which kind of had elements of what Blur were going to become in there, but they were on B-sides. You know, these songs with this fantastic guitar playing. Graham Coxon is one of the most talented guitar players that there is. I don't know what he's doing in Blur. He's like John Frusciante in the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He's better than the band he's in, and he's got more talent. But at the same point, even though Damon said in February 1992, success is almost inevitable now It wasn't. Blur was still snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. They were shambling along as a bunch of stumbling drunks, and they were not doing a great job of being Blur at all. Instead, they were at the middle point. They'd made their first album. The album had all the personality sucked out of it like a vacuum cleaner, and they weren't quite sure where they were going to go next. So there are two other releases around about this time. On the first one, which is part of the 21 box set, is this. It's the Seymour and Leisure era rarities. Effectively, if you buy 21, you get expanded 3 CD versions of most of their albums with unreleased material on. Quite why they didn't do proper box sets of that, I don't quite know. This features Dizzy and Mixed Up from the Seymour rehearsals, but it doesn't feature Tell Me, Shimmer, Long Legged, for example. It's got a demo of Sing, it's got a Seymour demo of Birthday, it's got a Seymour demo of Fall and She's So High, and it's got some Leisure demos on there. Won't Do It, a remix or a demo of I Know, Repetition, Always, which is an early version of I'm Fine, Come Together, I'm All Over, Wear Me Down, and an alternate 7-inch mix of High Call. But it's not essential stuff. Your knowledge of Blur will be not enhanced by this, really. Almost everything is absolutely fine, and you know almost everything that's in there. The most interesting document around about this period, and now it's released on DVD, was a documentary called Star-Shaped. And Star-Shaped is a curious hour following Blur on tour in 1992 and 1993, as they kind of shambolically stumble from one gig drunk to another gig drunk, and then play the gigs drunk. It's not fun. I've been watching it and I've been like, this looks unbearable. This looks like surrounded by idiots and morons. And of course, the more you drink or the more drugs you take, the stupider you become. That's the rule around drugs. The better time you have, but the stupider you become. And there's very definitely footage of various band members in various altered states, and I'm kind of watching it as a sober person going, that looks horrible. I mean, yes, you're having a fantastic time, but it looks just no fun whatsoever. In fact, the most interesting thing on here is the bonus features. So you've got 4 songs from the Leicester Princess Charlotte in 1990, a venue I went to hundreds of times, and what looks like a professionally shot and mixed Japanese television broadcast of the band live at the Kilburn National in 1991, adding pop scene, but then adding songs that like Oily Water and non-album tracks as well. So, for example, there's Pop Scene, Oily Water, Turn It Up, get an appearance on that show, but then there's also B-sides that are in there too, like Day Upon Day, Explain, stuff like that. It's interesting to watch, but my God, it was not fun to be part of. And I didn't see Blur at this point because I didn't think they were good enough. And I still don't think they're particularly good at this period, but you can start to see the things that the band are about to become. And the roles in the band changed after the fraud. I think Dave Rowntree, now a qualified lawyer and pilot apparently, became the band's business head and lawyer and general legal guy. Graham became kind of like the musical wonder kid. Damien became the very driven person that had an ambition and a workaholism about him. And Alex, and I'm going to have to say a nasty thing about Alex now, but to be fair, he's done it to himself, he has. That's what really hurts. If you read this, you get the impression that he was not a particularly nice man, who didn't take his responsibilities particularly seriously, certainly had no problem behaving appallingly towards his partner, and despite what he says in there, you get the impression he didn't take that behaviour particularly terribly either. The thing about being arrogant, and I think Alex was arrogant at this point, and very possibly an alcoholic or overindulging, was if you're going to be arrogant, you have to be brilliant to back it up, and if you aren't brilliant, you're just a dickhead with a big ego, and that is a problem. That's probably the worst thing I could say about any member of Blur. That is Leisure, the first Blur album, an album which I kind of watched and experienced, but I didn't see the band live during this period because there were other better bands that I liked more. It's a strange one to start with. some bands disown their first album. Kraftwerk, for example, don't obviously disown their first 3 albums. And they just kind of pretend those things didn't happen. It's the same kind of thing with Leisure. Very little of Leisure has been played live by the band in the past few years at all. I don't think they've played, I know since 1999, I don't think they've played things like Wear Me Down or Repetition or Birthday at all. And part of that is I think the band are a little bit embarrassed by the material. And to be honest, rightly so, it's not great songwriting at all. But what it is that it's the seeds which the band put towards what they're going to do next. And what they're going to do next is all about Britain and pop, and therefore becoming one of the very early forerunners, perhaps a bit too early, of the movement that was going to be terribly named as Britpop, which when I get to that one, I'm going to start talking about pulp. I'm going to start talking about Oasis, because we're getting into the 30th anniversary of Britpop. And if you're not seeing the signs of it now, you will be next summer when Liam tours his definitely maybe 30th anniversary show, and undoubtedly certain other bands from the periods are going to do 30th anniversary shows and massive 30th anniversary box sets of albums that weren't particularly good to start with. That's Blur. That's Leisure. This is me doing sleeve face. I hope it works. I can't see it because I can't see through a solid object. And I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves and each other. Stay beautiful. Bye.